All right, so this presentation is going to be about the early Mongol conquest and basically how they were able to come about. Next. Yeah, so, well, this is Genghis Khan here, and he's probably considered to be the most successful, not even just Central Asian conqueror, but just conqueror of all time. Yeah, yeah, we all probably are related to Genghis Khan. And, well, he had an empire that stretched from Poland to Myanmar, and people tend to consider him a bit of a historical anomaly because never before or since has anybody been able to just come out of the blue from what we consider to be the barbarian world and sweep across the entire world and take over the entirety of the known world essentially. But as I will be talking about in this presentation, Genghis Khan wasn't actually some sort of anomaly. I would say that this conquest was a long time coming, and that in some ways it's surprising that it didn't happen earlier, like the extent of the Mongol conquest. Next. All right, so first it's important to note some historical context to the Mongol Empire because they definitely weren't the first of the nomad empires. So the first ones were probably the Xiongnu. This is I believe, a Xiongnu belt buckle. The Xiongnu ruled from, I believe, the 3rd century AD, BC to the 1st century AD. And they were basically a confederation of what we might call today Huns, although that's not established. And under their ruler Modun Chanyu, they conquered a significant portion of the steppe as well as parts of northern China. And after that, there were a lot of other nomadic empires. This crown over here belongs to the Liao Khanate of the Khitan people, who were related to the Mongols in the 10th century AD. And they were succeeded by the Jin, who were the Jurchens, so the Manchus, the ancestors of the Qin dynasty. And the Jin themselves were overtaken by the Mongols. So you might be wondering, why is it that there are so many large nomadic empires that are being quickly succeeded by one another? Because you have one empire that maybe lasts 200 years, another empire that lasts 200 years. And when you look at sedentary empires like the Chinese empires, there were multiple dynasties, but each of them lasted at least 300 years. And the institution itself lasted for thousands of years. So there are a few reasons for that, but the main one lies with just the kind of society that these nomads lived in. Because the nomad armies were extremely powerful because they came from kind of a warlike environment. Because they lived on the steppe, that was a harsh, unforgiving life. There's a lot of blood feuds, they were fighting with each other. So essentially, they used their military to take over these sedentary societies. But once they took over these sedentary societies, they began to incorporate into that culture. You can see that with the Jin dynasty. They were all like horse archers. Then they took over, and their military became a lot weaker because they didn't have those harsh, unforgiving conditions that made their military powerful in the first place. So they were easily taken over by the Mongols. Well, not quite that easily because they had that new technology that came from Chinese culture. But eventually they fell to the Mongols because the Mongols themselves had that sort of culture of war and that culture of the horse archers that enabled them to defeat much larger armies. Next. Alright, so let's talk about the Mongol society in general. So there were two levels of Mongol society. There's the tribe and there's the supra-tribal or the empire. So we'll talk about the tribe here. And at the basic level, you have these pastoral tribes, these nomads, and their wealth was not based on money, it was based on their livestock. Because it was their livestock that they used to make their milk, to make their tents, to survive essentially. So tribes were also at war with each other a lot, as I mentioned earlier. Although they were in these loose confederations, but you have these things called blood feuds, where if one tribe, or one family rather, offended another family, there would be a culture of revenge around that, where that family would have to retaliate, and that first family would have to retaliate, and so on. And that led to a constant simmering level of violence within Mongol society. But it wasn't self-destructive necessarily, because there were no cities to destroy in the first place. People were just moving around all the time in search of greener pastures. And that meant that there was not that much destruction going on. But there was that simmering level of violence that toughened up the Mongol armies, essentially. All right, next. So now we look at the Mongol Empire. And I don't mean just like Genghis Khan's empire, but even before that. But because the Mongol tribes, although they did have that level of violence, they were also in these sorts of alliances or confederations that are very loose. And there's a few reasons why the Mongols weren't actually like in like a sort of centralized empire before that. But the main reason has to do with the fact that you can't really control pastoral nomads, because if you try to tax them, they'll just like move out of your land, right? Because they don't have any cities to tie them there. So you can't necessarily control them. You have to make them come to you out of their own will. And there's a few incentives for that. I would say the first one was raiding, because a single tribe isn't going to be able to like raid a whole friggin' city, right? You need a bunch of tribes coming together in an organized raid in order to extract wealth from agrarian societies, and that is exactly what a confederation did. Another way in which these tribes were organized was under a charismatic leader, such as Genghis Khan, because they had these tribes themselves had some sort of mandate of heaven. It was called a mandate of Tengri, who was their sky god, but it worked in a bit of a similar way, because if you had the mandate of Tengri and you were a charismatic guy, you were taking over all of these tribes, then more tribes would come to you, right? Because they think that you were being sent by God. But the problem is that the mandate of Tengri wasn't actually hereditary, unlike the mandate of heaven in China and divine right in Europe. So once a ruler died, it wasn't clear cut who would succeed them, and that's why a lot of these nomad empires were short-lived, because you have one charismatic ruler, they die, now the empire splits because they don't want to be under the new ruler, because they don't have the mandate of Tengri. So now let's talk about what was going on before Genghis Khan's birth. So this guy over here, his name is Aahaan Khan, and he was actually the ruler of the Mongol Empire before Genghis Khan was born, or rather, like, before he came to power, because the Mongol states were under this tribe called the Karygids. They're like the biggest Mongol tribe, and they basically had like a sort of confederation going on where all the Mongols were under them in some kind of like loose alliance of people. But soon after Genghis Khan's birth, that actually broke down, and in that power vacuum he was able to gain power. But we can see that Genghis Khan wasn't like some guy who just came out of nowhere and like just created an empire where there was none. There was already a confederation. He just turned that into an empire. Next. Yeah, so now we can take a look at what exactly did Genghis Khan do in order to create the Mongol Empire? So Genghis Khan understood that like this low level of violence that was going on, it wasn't necessarily a good thing, because in addition to the Mongols, like you have this huge Mongol thing over here, right? But there's other nomads. You have the Khitans who founded that Liao dynasty. You have all these tribes over here who are fighting against one another, because the Jin dynasty, they were basically like, hey, you guys are really cool, but then they said, you guys are also really cool. But essentially they were playing all the nomads off of each other. They were making all the nomads fight each other so that they themselves were protected. So Genghis Khan understood that he had to unify the Mongol tribes in order to take out all of the nomads, and then he could launch an all-out assault on the civilized societies like the Jin dynasty and the Song dynasty. So that was basically his big vision. And he did that, first of all, by being charismatic. Like I talked about the mandate of Tengri earlier. He was able to use like both his ruthlessness and his fairness to make people look up to him, and that because of that, a lot of accomplished people like flocked to him. Like one of his like most famous commanders, Jebe, he was actually an enemy of Genghis Khan. Like he was in another tribe, but Genghis Khan, like when he defeated that tribe, Jebe was like, "You can take my head. I was the one who killed your horse in the last battle." But instead, that Genghis Khan admired his courage and turned him into one of his most able warriors. So you can see how he's using that sort of like mercy in order to get people to flock towards him. Another thing he would do was make sure to justify his actions under Mongol culture. Like, for example, if there's a weak tribe and he wanted to attack it, he wouldn't always just attack it. He'd probably find an excuse first, like maybe there was treason going on. Or maybe there wasn't, he just fabricated. But he made sure to legitimize himself in the eyes of the Mongols, and that made more people come towards him. And that was why he was able to lead his Mongol confederacy over here against both the Karyats, who were led by his now rival Jabuka. And he was able to essentially get control over all of these guys over here. And by his death, he conquered all of this land. Basically all the nomad tribes, but also parts of the Jin dynasty over here. Yeah. Yeah, and now, last slide, we'll talk about Genghis Khan's reforms. So, Genghis Khan, as I said earlier, he built upon what was already there. He built upon the Karyat state. And, for example, we talked about how he was legitimizing himself with the Mandate of Tengri. We talked about how he was conquering other tribes in a fair manner, so to speak, or at least fair within Mongol culture. He also... another example of how he was working with existing institutions was he had a personal guard that was directly related to the previous Karyat guard. And in fact, it was a bit smaller, but it goes to show how he was using these existing institutions and centralizing them. You can see that in the army as well. Previous nomad empires had done this thing where they took these tribes and they split them into groups of 10. It was essentially a sort of decimal system. So 10 people under one person, 10 of those people at the next level under one person, and so on. And what he did was he actually split the tribes up to prevent this sort of blood feud thing from keeping on going and causing disunity. He was forcing these tribes to work together, and that ensured loyalty to him instead of the tribe. And you can actually see that today. After Genghis Khan died, a lot of these tribes essentially became reorganized. So you had these mixed Turco-Mongolic tribes that didn't actually exist before, but they were artificially created by Genghis Khan's military. What else? Yeah. So he was also wary of the influence of Chinese culture because, as we remember, once these tribes settled down, and once these nomad empires settled down and assimilated into the culture, they lose a lot of their edge that made their military that made them so strong. So he made sure to avoid that. First of all, he didn't appoint that many Chinese advisors. Secondly, he made sure to keep his culture, the Mongol culture, distinct from the Chinese culture. And that can be seen in how he created a new Mongol script for the Mongol language instead of using the existing Chinese script for it. So he was making sure to say we are the Mongols, we have a distinct cultural identity, and we are going to preserve that because that is what makes us strong, right? But on the other hand, he was using a lot of Chinese accomplishments. His siege warfare was all Chinese. An interesting anecdote is the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled Persia. Their strategy against the Mongols was to just hole all of their armies up into garrisoned cities, so that the Mongols would tire themselves out sieging. But the Mongols had learned new siege techniques from the Chinese, and they used that to defeat the Khwarezmians. Yeah, that's basically the presentation. Yeah, those are my sources.
Yeah. I think it went off minute through.
Yo, what's your name?